Right, the lighting's a bit Tales from the Crypt again, isn't it? Apologies. So, this video is going to be about the political and social stability under Adenauer, and particularly what happens in the elections where he is elected from 1949 onwards. So let's just go back and talk a little bit about the CDU. So in the period that we're looking at, 1949 to 63, it's pretty much a two-horse race in the elections between the CDU, Christian Democratic Union, and the SPD, the socialists who've come back after kind of obviously being underground during the Nazi era. CDU are centre-right, pro-business, pro-Christian values party, and their political programme, if you like, is largely based on a manifesto declared in 1947 called the Arlen Programme. I'll see if I can get the kind of things up there, which basically outlines support for business, support for property, with support for the welfare state and Christian values. So, 1949, Adenauer's CDU actually only polls 31% of the vote. And it takes weeks of negotiations for him to form a coalition, but he actually does so in the end with the FDP, the Free Democratic Party, who are a liberal party, quite pro-business party. He does significantly better in 1953, maintains this coalition. In 1957, for the first time, the CDU actually polled just over 50%, 50.2% in that election. So they don't need to maintain the coalition to stay in power. They've got an outright majority, but Adenauer chooses to do so. And his population wanes a little bit, and their electoral success drops again in the 1960s. We'll look at the decline of Adenauer in another video. But really, the story of the 1950s is steady, solid increase in popularity for Adenauer. And he actually campaigns in his most successful election, in the 1957 election, with the campaign No Experiments. He's very much seen as, experienced, steady hands on the steering wheel. The criticisms of this, the kind of counter analysis would be that he is overly dominant, that the systems of government become too focused on him. The phrase chancellor democracy has been used to describe Adenauer's rule. A democracy where the role of parliament itself is perhaps in the cabinet not as primary as it ought to be, and the chancellor has more influence than perhaps the constitution anticipated. But certainly this is a period that we see of political and social stability. And that actually isn't to be underestimated, because really the country that Adenauer comes to rule is in dire straits at the very beginning. Remember, the economic miracle does not happen overnight. Certainly a lot of Germans, West Germans in 1949, 1950 would be very surprised to hear anyone describe that they were going through or about to go through an economic miracle. There's about 4.5 million people disabled by the war in West Germany at 1949. Millions of refugees are coming in from East Germany and further afield, countries that are now Poland. A quarter of the nation's children have no father. There's quite limited support, and that's far more economically significant in an age when it's really quite difficult for single women to work or to find childcare to allow them to work. There's limited support for democracy. The last experience of democracy hadn't ended terribly well. And there's many people who are homeless, they've lost their properties. And there's also the kind of ongoing background situation about the Nazis themselves. How do you decide who is a serious Nazi? How do you decide who is just going along with it in order to keep their job? What do you do with either category? And actually, Adenauer deals with all of these challenges quite impressively. One of the first pieces of legislation that is passed in 1950 is to provide relief for those 4.5 million disabled people, returning prisoners of war and refugees. There's a kind of a tax levied to provide funding from them. 1951, one of the most controversial pieces of legislation, which is Law 131, which restores the employment and pension rights of former Nazis who have had jobs in the civil service, universities, government roles. What that does, obviously that's somewhat controversial. We're not in all cases talking about people that you'd necessarily choose to go on holiday with, and eyebrows are raised. But it's a significant number of people, and educated, influential, well-connected people who, if they're left outside in the cold, the risk is that they could turn hostile and become kind of vocal, influential opponents of democracy. So it's strategic as much as anything else. It's about reintegration. He also makes a statement about the Nazi past and significant reparations to Israel. And I'll put the details of that in the comments. The 1952 Equalisation of Burdens law is another step towards recognising that the war hasn't necessarily affected everybody in quite the same way. So there is a tax on... not a dry cough. There is a tax on the property and savings of those who haven't lost as much as some others to raise funds to be redistributed for others. Raises 143 billion Deutschmarks, which is a hugely significant sum. It's not quite the whole-scale restructuring of society that, say, the SPD would have liked to see, but it is a real indication of goodwill, of a sense that we are all in this together. The state does have a role to play in making sure that society is, giving equal opportunities to everybody despite different experiences and backgrounds. Over 4 million houses are built, new homes, by 1957, and wages increased 400% between 1949 and 1963. Pensions and an insurance-based healthcare system are introduced to ensure that there's kind of a safety net and support for all. And overall, living standards, very, very few people are left behind. Living standards increase, people have got more disposable income. That disposable income, as we've mentioned, of course, stimulates demand in itself. The only other criticism that could be made of Adenauer, and it is increasingly made by the younger generation, is that he really does stand for prosperity, and prosperity of a kind of older bourgeois class, that there's a kind of a slight trapping of self-satisfaction, not being particularly reflective, there not being a particularly effective opposition. It's described as an age of vanishing opposition until the 1960s, when things start to change a bit, as we'll look at in a further video. But really, in terms of the improving living standards and the wage increases and the disposable income and the housing and the welfare state, I think probably most West Germans would have been fairly happy with having to accept that they had a fairly bourgeois, potentially quite self-satisfied chancellor for most of the 1950s.